Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. Our special guest has been on the show before, and I'm so delighted that he's here again with us today. Dr. Michael Lee is here to share with us how to manage stress and anxiety during conflicts. So, is it possible to address conflict calmly and constructively when it arises? Well, today's guest is here to share with us how to do just that. So, Dr. Michael Lee teaches and writes in the areas of political communication and rhetoric. He received his PhD in communication studies at the University of Minnesota and his MA in communication and BA in political science at the University of Georgia. His research focuses on political branding, political identity, strategic communications, and audience positioning in American politics. And he's currently a professor at the College of Charleston. So welcome to the show, Dr. Michael Lee.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Well, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this. So, how should we approach disagreements, especially when we're dealing with sensitive topics?
It's a really great opening question. I sort of think we need to think about what we think as individuals, as communities, maybe even as a society, about the role of disagreement in our lives. You know, sometimes we treat disagreement like it's an irritant, like traffic, and we just need to minimize it at all costs. Sometimes we treat conflict like it's always explosive. You know, it can always be a grenade in our hands that's live, and we need to be as far away from it as possible. And we can also treat disagreement like it can be potentially productive. You know, it has its potential downsides that we're all familiar with, but it can be really productive and relationship strengthening and inspire curiosity. And hey, maybe it can even be fun sometimes. And so perhaps we can make more space for disagreement in our lives, whether it's a contentious relationship or a polarized nation.
Well, it's such great advice. And, what role do disagreements play in strengthening or weakening relationships?
Well, I'll take the second part of that first. I mean, the weakening obviously is we can say things we don't mean, we can take things too far, we can be really bad about making repairs after argumentative violations have happened. And so I think that the downsides of disagreement are pretty obvious to all of us. And we have a kind of built in as human beings negativity bias. And so we fear the worst from conflict, right? We fear the worst from disagreement. They can always snowball out of control. I do lots of debate and dialogue workshops around the country for universities, for companies, as et cetera. And the question I almost always get is, you know, what if the disagreement spirals out of control? And my answer is that, of course, that's always a risk. But in my experience, doing this for 20 years now, the risk of self-censorship and suppression, because people are so fearful of that negativity bias of it spiraling out of control, is a much greater risk that people don't feel heard. And so, to transition to the first part of the question, it can really strengthen relationships when people feel seen and heard, and sometimes it takes a conflict in order to do that. And we've all been in relationships, whether they're big community relationships or just one-on-one personal relationships, where something needed to be said, a fight needed to be had, a conflict needed to be endured by all the parties involved, and you come out even stronger on the other side and can even make a joke about it and laugh about it because the issue is now settled because the conflict is healthy.
Okay, so this is probably like the $1 million question here. How can we manage a disagreement, especially when they become emotionally charged? I think that would be really challenging.
Yeah, that is the $1 million question, and I have an answer. I don't think there's settled science on this, but the way I approach it is twofold. One is what's happening between, and then two, what's happening within. So between, I mean conversationally between two people. So let's say you and I are having a disagreement, and I kind of out of turn call you a name or make a really uncharitable assumption about you and why you believe the way that you believe. You know, taking a step back there and saying, you know, do you think it's okay, Mike, if we call each other names during this discussion, right? And we can come up in the moment, even in a heated moment, with at least a kind of shared set of values around how we should address each other. It's very unlikely that both of us would say, yeah, we think name calling is a good idea. This is probably going to go really well if we just slur names at each other. Another way to do it is to try to engage in a principle of reciprocity. And so I try to model curious behavior, have some humility about myself, encourage you to do the same. If I make a claim about the world, I try to say a source, a very specific source, and ask that you do the same. And so it can be kinds of norms of evidence giving and back and forth, but also how we treat each other. And the second part was what's happening within. In other words, to see how the stress of conflict activates your body, your mind. Your vision narrows. Maybe you're balling your hands, maybe you're sweating, maybe your heart is racing, maybe it's going really slow. Maybe you feel sick to your stomach and you want to leave. All the kinds of ways that your nervous system, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, is activated. And then noticing too what's happening within in terms of your ego, right? Are you wanting to win this argument because it means something to you, or are you trying to win this argument because winning means something? Because there's an ego investment or some tribal affiliation. You need to signal to other people that you're on their team. Is that on the line? And so, again, back up and say, what's happening within? Is there a way that I can manage my stress better internally? And then what's happening between? Is there a way that you and I can come to some consensus about a better way to treat each other and a better way to understand each other?
So, in your opinion, because I know you have this really, top-rated show that covers a lot of this, what is the most important thing to remember when engaging in a difficult conversation?
What comes to mind for me and the way to, I think, not feel like the disagreement, the difficulty is just something to be endured, but to frame it. Therapists like to say, framing is feeling, right? And so are you framing this thing as the grenade, as I talked about? It's about to go off at any time, and you're kind of approaching it sheepishly, trepidatiously. Is it just something like traffic to be endured and you just kind of grit your teeth and just look sneer at it? Or is this an opportunity? And so the number one thing I would approach conflict with is curiosity. Be curious about the extent to which you feel the way that you feel, how conflict affects your life, your body, your relationship. Curious about why the other person feels the way that they feel, and curious about how it affects your relationship, and curious, frankly, about what you can learn. Even if there's somebody you're disagreeing with and you vehemently disagree with them, you think their opinion is monstrous. It's possible to learn something not just about that person and why they believe what they believe and the life experiences that have led them there, but also the world. They're not the only person who feels this way. And so, why does this large group of people feel a way about whatever the issue is in a way that you feel is monstrous, right? Why is this thing provide security for this group of people? So curiosity is my answer, but there's lots of good answers to that question.
So, how can people maintain empathy for one another during really intense emotional disagreements?
I like to suggest that we humanize the process of disagreement with the understanding that great minds don't always think alike, in the sense that disagreement and conflict is an inevitably human process, and some humility too. If you approach conflict like you're on your righteous high horse and you've never gotten a fact wrong or a date wrong, or your values haven't changed over time, your relationships, you haven't changed over time, then of course the other person might feel like they're talking to a brick wall, or somebody who's unpersuadable, or somebody who's not trying to see them in their humanity and their opinions, whether or not they're right or wrong, good or bad, up or down. And so some humility about yourself too. I mean, what are some things that I think right now? What are some things that I'm doing right now that people 20 years from now or 200 years from now will think, how could that monster live that way? Right? Or how could he live with such an obviously contradictory set of values? Right? How did that tension not just tear him apart? But these are my contradictions. These are my internally inconsistent beliefs, and I'm used to them. So I just wander around with them, and I don't think twice about it. And I certainly don't know how values are going to change, and how I might look back at myself 10 years from now and think, God, I can't believe I was living that way. But I don't feel a ton of regret about it or shame about it right now. So some humility, and then again, some curiosity about why the other person feels the way that they do.
So, what are some strategies for managing stress and anxiety when confronted with a very heated discussion?
Internally, I definitely like to start with the body, to listen to your body. What is your body telling you? Where do symptoms of stress and anxiety show up? Are there ways to deactivate in the moment? A lot of times it's hard to kind of think yourself out of a panic attack or think yourself out of stress, and easier to manage those symptoms. Sometimes that can be in terms of taking a break. Sometimes that can be in terms of a walk. I really prefer bilateral stimulation, moving your eyes side to side, having something in your hands and moving that back and forth if you can, and it's situationally appropriate. Walking, that bilateral stimulation can really help settle nerves in a moment. It's kind of hard to have a big fight and while you're walking, you know. You'll notice if you get into a conflict with somebody while you're walking, you'll stop so that you can say the thing and you're stationary. And then, but the walk is can reduce it. And so if you're stuck there in the moment too, you can speak to the person about it. I mean, a lot of us don't like to confess that we're having stress, confess that we are affected by stress or by conflict. And sometimes confession can be incredibly powerful, incredibly humanizing to make that public and not endure that privately, and to say, I'm really having a reaction right now, and I just need you to know that, you know. I think so. Confession is a great way around it. Some bilateral stimulation, trying to work through the body, and then finally listen to the stress. A lot of times we get in trouble as people, individuals, and relationships, and certainly as a nation, by ignoring stress, by putting our hands in the sand, by trying to de-stress, or by treating all stress like it's distress or chronic stress. Some stress can be good. And so my point is that what is the anxiety trying to tell you? What information is it giving you? Maybe it's giving you information about your values and you really care about this thing. Maybe it's giving you information about the relationship and you don't really like the way that you're being treated, and it makes you anxious to face this person in this context. But rather than putting your head in the sand or suppressing the anxiety, listen to it. It has valuable information.
So here's another hot question for you. So, how can we discern between a disagreement that is worth addressing versus one that's not worth our emotional energy?
I'd say a lot of this, there's a lot of really great social science on what can be a healthy disagreement, on persuasion, on how to bring people to your side, on healthy relationships. Certainly, attachment styles come to mind. But then there's also just an art to this, a kind of situational, relational, personal judgment. And for this question, I would defer a little bit to the latter rather than the former, which is to say, decidedly, that it depends on the relationship, right? And it depends on the context. So let's say you and I have a long-term friendship, but I feel like you've been gaslighting me on X, Y, and Z issues for years. And I'm finally fed up. But you gaslight me on something very small that you did last night, right? Is this specific infraction worth it in the grand scheme of things? No. But my frustration levels have peaked and I've been suppressing, the anxiety I feel about this relationship for a long time. And so in that moment, it becomes necessary. So it's difficult on the outside looking in and saying, these matter in these situations, but not in these others. It's always relationally dependent. It's always a little bit contextual of what matters. So what I'd recommend that's more general and not so it dependsy is to figure out what you want from the relationship. Figure out what you want in terms of frequency, in terms of duration, in terms of relational intensity, and then work backwards from there to say, when is conflict appropriate? When is it necessary? How can it be maximized for its productive potential and minimized for its destructive potential? And then if you have a person in your life who you're not that close to, it's a person in your life that you see every Thanksgiving, for instance, and then the question becomes, should I debate this person about the Trump presidency or insert hot topic here? The answer can be driven by the goal of the relationship, which is not every fight needs to be had at all times. Not every fight needs to be ignored at all times. It sort of depends on what you want with this relationship. And so if I want to preserve this relationship and just talk about NASCAR with my uncle, then that's okay.
So, when we encounter abusive behavior in a conversation, how can we respond without escalating the conflict?
Well, if it's abusive, there's two ways around it. One, for me, call it out instantly. I'm not and call it out in terms of identifying the behavior, I don't appreciate it when you call me X. Then second, invoke a norm. Would you appreciate it in return if I called you names, or do you think it's healthy? Do you think it's productive for people to name call in the course of a discussion? So invoke a norm of very basic human reciprocity. And a lot of the advice that I give around healthy debate, dialogue, discussion, negotiation is invoking that spirit of reciprocity, the do as I do. I give you a compliment. It was kind of a natural human tendency to either say thank you or to perhaps give a compliment in return. If I told you something, Marianne, that was deeply personal right now, you in turn might feel compelled to share something really visceral with me that happened in your life. And that can really be powerful in conflicts too. Um, and so I would, one, call it out to identify the norm that you hope that both of us can behave by, the one that you've been trying to uphold. Try again not to be condescending here, but to say, I think we both agree it's a better idea for us to move forward without name calling, because God knows there's a bunch of names I'd like to call you, but I'm just not going to do it. And then third, be willing to walk. Absolutely be willing to walk or just take a break. Take a break all the way to walking and setting a firmer boundary. Because if an abuser is not going to end the abuse, and you have no burden to subject yourself, period, to abuse.
What advice would you give someone who feels overwhelmed or intimidated by conflict in relationships?
I would ask them why. I would ask them what it is about. One, is it the relationship? Is this a person who thinks that conflict leads to anger and anger leads to rage, and rage is uncontrollable and unpredictable? So is it all conflict? Is it this specific relationship? Is there something about, maybe you have a fairly peaceful relationship, for whatever reason you don't feel safe having a conflict with this person? And then three, I would ask if it's something about the issue. Is there something specific about this particular contentious issue that is making them that anxious? So I'd go in that order. Is this a personality feature about conflict? Somebody's just kind of conflict avoidant or suppressant? And is it relational? And then third, is it something specific about the subject? And then work on a healthier, more consistent approach to conflict. And again, it's almost like public speaking too. Like, the goal of getting a little better, a little more comfortable at public speaking is not to end distress. Having stress is an important part of being a human being. There's something that's happening in our modern culture where we feel like if I'm not completely de-stressed, right? If I'm not completely regulated, then I've somehow failed in the process of being a successful human, a calm human. Having some stress during or before a public speech actually can be great, and it also shows you that you value being successful in that context. The same is true with conflict. The goal is not to end all stress around conflict, right? Just the same way the goal is not to eliminate all heat around fire. Fire can be very productive in heating your house, but we don't want it to burn it down. And same is true with stress and conflict. Let's minimize stress. We can regulate ourselves, not quite be quite so activated, and use the stress that we're feeling positively.
So, how can people navigate situations where they strongly disagree with a loved one, but they want to preserve that relationship? I know you said walking, and
Yeah,
that's
walking's
I'm
good.
going to do that. I'll tell you. So, what are some other things that we can do as far as navigating that?
So let's take a hypothetical. You and I disagree about the new President Trump, and we are going to have some contentiousness, some antagonism over the second Trump presidency here. I would ask us to figure out what the goal of this conversation is, and then work backwards. Is the goal for me to prove that I'm right and you're wrong? Is the goal for us to feel heard and seen? Is the goal to strengthen or destroy the relationship? So in many ways, when we have these kinds of either political or personal contentiousness, what we need to do is identify a goal, identify a value. Maybe we both agree that the president should try to make the country safer, and then we work backwards to contesting whether he's actually doing that or not. Maybe we agree that the president should try to make the country more prosperous or more inclusive or more equal, and then work our way backwards to look at his new executive orders, for instance, or the administration's agenda and ask whether it accomplishes that goal. And then finally, I really favor the kind of like common ground sandwich. Like if we really want to reaffirm the value of our relationship, but we would need to sneak some heavy discussion in there, we start with something we both mutually love. It could be completely irrelevant to the topic at hand, whether it's the Australian Open or jazz music or jelly beans, whatever it is, and then have the conversation that's so hard, and then back to common ground, right? So common ground, and then contention, and then back to common ground. So I really like focusing on shared values. I really like asking, what is the point? What do we both hope to get out of this discussion? And introducing some levity and some humor, because it's not like you or I's opinion about the Trump presidency is frankly in any way going to change the Trump presidency. And so having some humility about A, I could be wrong, and B, does my strong opinion on this really matter? You know, if I had no opinion, would the world be any different? Probably not. And then three, common ground sandwich is a good idea for managing individually difficult discussions.
Well, you're definitely the go-to person when it comes to dealing with conflict. Dr. Michael Lee, can you share about your show with us and the work you do where people can connect with you?
Yes, I direct an organization at the College of Charleston here in Charleston, South Carolina, called the Civility Initiative, and we do debate and dialogue workshops on effective listening, effective arguing, effective storytelling, coexisting with difference across the board. We do it on campus, in the wider community, for companies, et cetera. And then, of course, the national conversation about our shared coexistence as Americans with hopefully less tension and more collaboration. To that end, I also host a podcast called When We Disagree. And the basic premise of the show is pretty simple, which is, what's a disagreement that just stuck with you? A conflict you had a year ago, a decade ago, or forever ago that you just can't get out of your head. And the show covers disagreements that are personal, that are philosophical, that are professional, that are political. And all that matters for the show is that it matters to the person who's on the show. Shows are about 20 minutes. It's one guest and one story at a time. So if you were on the show, I'd ask you to tell us an argument story, and you would narrate whatever conflict you had with a best friend when you were in college, perhaps, that sticks with you for whatever reason. And we start in the trees and look at the individual who, what, where, when, why, and then kind of broaden out into the forest and what it says about you and your relationships and your conflict style that just stuck with you all this time. And what can we all then learn from these individual stories of conflict, some of which are really productive and strengthen relationships, some of which are more nuclear and ended relationships, and some of which, frankly, are just confusing. The participants don't even really know what they were fighting about in the first place, or maybe it started to be about one thing, but it turned into an argument about something completely and totally different. I love the show. I love the variety of stories on the show, the variety of conflict styles, and the variety of ways that it affects all of our lives. You know, it's inevitable that we're all going to be in memorable conflicts in our lives. And we're in the middle of season 2 now. We've put out about 50 or 60 episodes or so, and I plan on doing it for as long as I can and very much enjoy it.
Dr. Michael Lee, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thanks so much, Marianne.
Well, thank you, Dr. Michael Lee. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about how to manage stress and anxiety during conflicts. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.